Well, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our Big Book telephone workshop. This is being recorded. Today is September 18th here in Los Angeles, California. Please join me in the set-aside prayer. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. The assignment for next week is to begin taking a look at the instructions on step 4. Today I plan on having a final discussion about step 3, hearing from you concerning any questions or concerns, and if in fact we're all satisfied that we've done what we need to do to prepare for step 3, then at the conclusion of the call today, I will invite you to pray the step 3 prayer from the Big Book on page 63. It was interesting as I was going over the assignments over the weekend and preparing for this call, reviewing what we've done on steps 2 and 3, that I realized that we actually hadn't, at least I hadn't, reviewed with you part of the assignment in step 2 that completed the reading of Bill's story. And I actually see that as maybe a way I will shift the instructions so that this final piece will be reviewed at this time prior to taking the 3rd step, because it's Bill's experience in the hospital of being contacted by Evie, going through the steps in the hospital on his 2nd day of hospitalization, and then on his 3rd day of hospitalization, having his mountaintop spiritual experience. And then getting free from that and talking about what he did from that point on once he got out of the hospital. So actually, it's a pretty good assignment to address right at this time, rather than in step 2 and before step 3. It probably doesn't make that much difference, but I think it's a nice way to take a look at how Bill did the 3rd step, what his experience was, and then how did it manifest in his life when he continued to apply the spiritual principles that he had learned and adopted in the Oxford group. On page 9, he says he's meeting with Evie at his home, and Evie is sober for the first time. And he explained that he had met some folks at the Oxford group, and that he had gone through a process, those 6 steps that we've looked at. You could refresh your memory by looking at page 263 in the 4th edition. Those 6 steps are listed there. And that he had come now, that he had had his spiritual awakening, to pass his experience on to Bill. many lessons here to learn, not the least of which is the initiative, the proactivity of reaching out to somebody that's suffering, not waiting. Literally calling him, going to meet him. It says he had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. And of course, Bill on page 10 says, I was interested because at that point I had realized my hopelessness. He takes a look at his own history as he and Abby are talking that night. Now, Bill is drinking his bathtub gin and pineapple juice. Bill had some disgusting combinations, but it probably made it taste better and it got the job done. He says, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut. What a great opposite in terms of the way we start, where in fact we pray that our mind is pried open. Because we know we have prejudice. We know. And sometimes we don't know how ignorant and prejudiced we actually really are. But what we do know is that what we've done up to that point hasn't been as effective as we want it to be. On page 11, he does conclude, even though he has some misgivings about this whole God concept, God had done for him what he could not do for himself. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. He had admitted complete defeat, and he had been raised from the dead. These are Bill's poetic terms, looking at Ebby. Here sat a miracle, he said. He was much more than inwardly reorganized, page 12. He was on a different footing. See, Bill's so bright, so intuitive. He could sense. His roots grasped a new soil, he said, about Ebby Thatcher, not about himself. And Bill is still resisting because he had some training from the man who raised him, his mother's father, his grandfather, from age, I think, 12 years old, maybe 13. This grandfather was very skeptical against organized religion, probably fairly spiritual in the poetic, mystical sense, living out in the country. He had a wonderful relationship with nature, the grandfather. And so Ebby suggests, well, I understand you have this resistance to the word God and organized religion. And he says, why don't you choose your own concept of God? Page 12. I mean, that's revolutionary. Think about it. Ebby's in the Oxford group, started by a Lutheran minister, led at this time by an Episcopal minister. I mean, this is basic Christianity. Evangelical, maybe fundamental. And Ebby says, well, why don't you choose your own concept? I heard an interview with him, and he was asked, where did that come from, Ebby? And Ebby said blithely, quickly, without much thought, that was the teaching of the Oxford group. That was shocking to me. The Oxford group themselves were quite broad and inclusive. Even though they were trying to recreate first century Christianity, they really had the spirit of the Spirit. Not exclusive, but all inclusive, which is what Bill brought to the big book. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. That's exactly what we reviewed in step 2 in chapter 4. Nothing more was required. This is in italics, that's why I'm reading it. To make a beginning. Growth could start from that point. And that's what he said. in step 2 on page 47. Willingness is the cornerstone. Upon a foundation of complete willingness, I might build what I saw in my friend. See, Ebby was the model. He did very little talking, very little preaching. He just explained, he shared his experience. On page 13, Bill goes back into the hospital. This is his third drunk this year, his third hospitalization drunk this year. And Ebby shows up again at the hospital. I was separated from alcohol. That was his first day, December 11th. He had signs of delirium tremens. That's why he needed hospitalization and professional detoxification. On page 13, though, on the second day, Ebby shows up again. His initiative, again, the proactive nature of trying to help others by reaching out, spending time, spending effort, spending money in order to get to the hospital here in New York. There I humbly offered myself to God. He's taking the steps now. As I understood God, to do with me as God would, I placed myself unreservedly under his care and protection. Now, of course, Bill is writing this in 1939. So it's not the consciousness that he had in 1934. This is December 1934 that he's talking about. It's 5 years later. Bill has a whole bunch more experience and consciousness and has explained it many times and therefore has wonderful phraseology. I ruthlessly faced my sins, step 4, and became willing to have my newfound friend, capital F, that's a synonym for God, equivalent to our 6th and 7th step today. Take them away, root and branch. My schoolmate visited me, Ebby. I fully acquainted him with the problems and deficiencies. I did a 5th step. I did the confession of the Oxford group steps. We made a list of people I had hurt. And I was willing to make amends once I get out of the hospital. I'm still in the hospital. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. My friend promised me I would have the elements of a way of living which answered all my problems, not just my alcohol problem, all my life problems. Belief in the power of God, enough willingness, honesty, and humility to establish and maintain. The words are all so important. The new order of things, essential requirements. And here's one of my most favorite paragraphs. I quote it all the time because it's a wonderful summary of the program, especially the first approach. Simple but not easy, page 14. A price had to be paid. It meant the destruction of self-centeredness. The key to step 1, as we saw, is unmanageability, the spiritual malady, selfishness and self-centeredness, the root of the problem. And then he says, here's the solution. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. It's no coincidence, this phrasing and the connection to the 3rd step made a decision to turn. The whole point of this spiritual process is that transformation, that turning from my self-centeredness to other-centeredness. Other with a capital O, a synonym for God, higher power. Other with a small o, the human community in my surroundings that I'm invited to help. I turn in the 11th step. I turn in the 12th step. My experience is I am turned. And then he describes his spiritual experience, literally mountaintop. We've talked about it at the beginning of the workshop. You can read it again on page 14. This is his third day of hospitalization. The day after, he works all the steps and has, at least internally and maybe to Ebby, committed that he will take care of the amends when he gets out. He hasn't made any amends yet. He's just resolute about making them. And he is given freedom from his alcohol problem. He knew with certainty. He also was given the instinct and the insight that this was now his destiny, to carry this message to other people. He says at the bottom of that page, another most favorite line for me, because it explained the speculation about relapse for Jim, the guy who put a little whiskey in his milk. On page 35, it says he failed to enlarge his spiritual life, but he doesn't tell us what those words, that phrase means there, but here he does. Page 14 at the bottom, referring to step 6 of the Oxford group steps, the steps that Bill and Ebby knew prior to the big book. For if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, bam. Not about prayer and meditation. It's not about church. Not even about living a good life. We perfect and enlarge our spiritual life by carrying the message to other people. He reinforces that on the page 15, talking about the benefits to me. It turns my emotions around. I shared before we got on the line today. I have been somewhat dismissive of meetings in the last year, very busy with lots of other things, spiritual things, family things, the workshops and retreats, and I have even written an article on meetings are not the program 5 years ago. And somehow, unbeknownst to me, in that strange mental blank spot that is my Achilles heel, I must have developed some kind of dismissiveness, some kind of personal negativity, some type of making me an exception to going to meetings that I'm not responsible for, I'm not the speaker in, or I'm not running a workshop. And between that and several other component parts, a car accident in which I had a whiplash, medication in which I hadn't completely evaluated the side effects, a little abuse of my time with regard to lack of sleep. The perfect storm. I went into a depression. I didn't know I was depressed because it was incremental. But because I began to really suffer, I began to investigate the source of the suffering, thinking that, in fact, I'm burnt out and I probably need to take a break from all of this work that I'm involved in. Up till then, I had a passion and a clarity. But at this point, I had no passion and no clarity. In fact, it was very difficult. Cognitively impaired would be a phrase that would be applicable. Maybe some of you actually noticed it over the last month or two, because it was 4 months. And then I suffered so much, I started to try to figure out a solution. And I began to talk about it, of course, to some trusted people. And I looked up the ingredients, the side effects of this medication. And of the 8 side effects, I had 7. So I obviously stopped it. And within a week of doing other things like going to regular meetings, talking to regular people, talking specifically about this condition that I just experienced, getting the right amount of sleep, eating the balance kind of whatever. Just the basics. I'm saying this, I don't know why I'm saying it, but I think it's appropriate here. Because no matter how much information and how much vital life that we have, there's still the potential for a misstep. And it talks about meetings here on page 15. We meet frequently so that newcomers may find the fellowship. I had an absolute conviction that there are three things that we need if we're going to be on a spiritual life. Number one is a path. Number two is a teacher. And number three is a community. Totally committed to that. I can see that as the warp and woof of my own life for the last 35 years. My path is the 12 steps. My teachers are a variety of people: sponsors, step guides, therapists, spiritual directors, good friends, and a spouse. And the fellowship is my community. He said, not really ever examining it, assuming that because I'm in a 12-step group and I'm committed to the fellowship, that in fact I have a community. And after a couple of meetings, informal as they were, and as normal and regular as they were, one mixed and one stag, I realized for the very first time, meetings are not the fellowship, and meetings are not the community, and the word fellowship is not the community. That if I go to meetings, I will in fact develop a community. That's a relationship with people under the umbrella of the fellowship. Now that might seem like, gosh, Herb, where have you been? And it's a really legitimate question. I just had not thought it through. I didn't have a community, meaning people with whom I could be, many people with whom I could be comfortable, transparent, sharing just like normal people share, without teaching, without being concerned of being a model. Meetings are not the program, but it's in the meetings that we will find our community. And I've just turned the burner up on it and begun to improve the communication with the community I already had, but it got stagnant. To have a deeper conversation with the sponsor that I've had for 3 years, but it's kind of maintained a very superficial relationship. And we went very deep this last week and a half in terms of the transparency and the communication that I talk about, but I just didn't think it was necessary because I have such a vital spiritual life. And I've got 2 daughters who were in program and we talk every day. Nice, but not good enough. Didn't know I was going to make this that personal, but I think it's got its own value coming up here to the 3rd step. Faith has to work 24 hours a day in and through us or we perish. Each day, my friend's simple talk in our kitchen multiplies itself in a widening circle of peace on earth and goodwill to men. And so here we are on page 63, preparing ourselves for the 3rd step. You've seen and heard and read and highlighted the promises on page 63. When we sincerely take this position, of course, it's a relationship. My interpretation, the big book's not that clear, that the 3rd step is about a relationship, but Bill talks about it at the bottom of page 62 and in the 2 paragraphs on page 63. He talks about a relationship. And I've encouraged you to confirm the relationship. Number 1, that step 2, your decision there, connotes. What does it imply, your step 2 decision about a concept? And what does it reveal to you about the potential of a relationship? And I use the term a relationship that your heart, your soul, the very marrow of your bones yearns for. Love that word, yearns for. We had a new relationship, being all powerful. God provides what I need, not what I want. Two conditions. If I keep close to God, maybe step 11, and perform God's work well, maybe step 12. Established on such a footing, we became less and less interested in ourselves. Here's the dimmer switch, here's the process, here's the promise. More and more, we became interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. Incremental, dimmer switch, promise, process. As we felt new power flow in, as we enjoyed peace of mind, as we discovered we could face life successfully, as we became conscious of God's presence. Wonderful promises here, rich promises. It's directional. It's not confirmational. It's not like the 9th step. The 9th step says you have arrived. This is now happening to you. It is a promise. This is your reality. Not in step 3 and not in step 5. Respectively, 2 different paragraphs, page 63 for step 3, page 75 for step 5, that describe wonderful promises that are of approximation, directional, not a conclusion like this is where you're at and it's going to manifest. No, it's just saying, yeah, it might. Pay attention to this. You might begin to have the seeds of it. You might begin to have the sense of it. We begin to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, or the hereafter. We are reborn, given a new life. Later on, Bill says, this is only a beginning, like being reborn. It's the beginning. This is not action. Somewhat, a little bit of action, because it is a prayer, and Bill suggests that we do it in community. We take this spiritual step with an understanding person, voicing it without reservation. Of course we have reservations. What does it mean? What are going to be the implications? And we don't know and we can't predict, except the way the big book talks. In step 12 especially, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. That's the journey and that's the destination. A spiritual awakening, like Bill had on the mountaintop in his 3rd day of hospitalization. He had the experience. We're probably all going to have an awakening, have had, and will have more. That's totally my experience. So I would like to talk to some individuals about their questions, certainly, or any concerns they might have about steps 2 and 3. If you have written out your own version of the step 3 prayer, I think we'd all enjoy hearing that, but it's not a requirement that you do that. I mean, read it out. It's not even, it's just a suggestion that you even do it, meaning prepare it. And it was a suggestion in the big book. He said the words are quite optional. My step guide used that as a prompter to say, well, try to write out your own prayer, not to improve the one in the book, but to understand it, so that you get underneath the words, underneath the phrases. By having to put them in your own words, you'll have to understand the ones in the book, which will make it much more relevant for us. So please join me in closing with the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.